Shalom, guys. I've got something really fun for you today. This one's kind of been burning in me for a little bit, and I have time today to sit down and record this. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, something pretty cool that I saw recently in Scripture that connects very precisely with much of what we talk about on this channel in terms of marriage and what Scripture does and does not say, and what Yah's will is and is not. So let's buckle up. Let's get the intro out of the way so we can get after this thing. All right, guys. Welcome back. This is exciting, and I'm really looking forward to having a little bit of this conversation with you. I don't know how long this will take, but we've got multiple articles to take a look at because there's something really cool in Egyptian history that we need to look at as compared to what Scripture tells us to do and not to do. So often in our journey, we talk about Leviticus 18. And Leviticus 18 gets brought up all the time, particularly with regards to verses 17 and 18. However, there's some particular things here that we need to look at much broader in terms of Leviticus chapter 18 and what it has to say with regards to marriage. Before we do that, I want to invite you to come join us on Patreon. Have you been searching for deeper understanding of biblical family structure? We were once where you are, full of questions, seeking answers in Scripture. That's why we created this special community, a place where seekers become family, where questions meet experience, and where biblical teachings come alive. Join us on Patreon and discover private discussions in our Telegram groups, real conversations about family and headship, a supportive community that grows together, and direct access to experienced mentors. Whether you're just starting your journey or deepening your understanding, we're here to walk alongside you. Take the first step. Join our family today, and let's grow together in understanding and fellowship. Shalom, and welcome home. So, Leviticus chapter 18. Let me turn this thing around here for you so you can see what I'm seeing. I'm taking a look right now at Blue Letter Bible. Highly recommend Blue Letter Bible. It's a fantastic free resource online that you can use to do a lot of deep digging into Scripture. We're not going to need to go deep into Scripture today, but we do want to take a look at a big piece of it. So Leviticus chapter 18 begins, Then Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to Bnei, the sons, Bnei Israel, and say to them, I am Yahweh your Elohim. You shall not do what was done in the land of Egypt where you once lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes to live in accord with them. I am Yahweh your Elohim. You shall keep my statutes and my judgments by which a man may live if he does them. I am Yahweh. Okay, that is the beginning of the chapter. And then, of course, it goes into a whole lot of information about sexual relations. None of you shall approach any blood relative to uncovered nakedness, so on and so forth. And it goes all the way down, not uncovering the nakedness of your son's daughter, your daughter's daughter, your father's wife's daughter, etc., so on and so forth. We get to verse 17, a verse that often is not quoted in the polygyny discussion, because everybody wants to go straight to verse 18. But we need to look at this one very quickly and just touch on it. It says, You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter, nor shall you take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are blood relatives. It is lewdness. This is a statement against polygyny if you are taking a woman and her daughter. Now, a lot of people want to use verse 18 and say, verse 18 says you shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister, and then they make sisters very broad. All women are sisters, right? This is what they want to do. They ignore the phrase that says as a rival, or to be as a rival, to be a rival while she is alive to uncover her nakedness. They try to use this verse right here, ignoring the as a rival, and then broadening what as a sister is, to say no polygyny at all. Well, of course, if that be true, then there's no need for a verse before that forbids a mother and her daughter. Okay? So the very fact that this verse says you shall not take a mother and her daughter, by definition, means that taking a woman and another woman who is not her daughter is not covered by this law or any other. This is simply a regulation on taking two women as long as they are not close relatives in terms of a mother and a daughter, or in this verse as two sisters to be rivals to each other. And this is, again, this whole chapter is in the context of blood relatives, okay? We did have that at the beginning. You shall not approach any blood relative to uncover nakedness, okay? So the whole depth of the blood relative issue is covered all through this, and we realize all of this has to do with blood covering, okay? And then it continues into, beginning with verse 19, continues into some other types of indecency, other types of impurities that we could fall under the heading of types of sexual impurity. Some might call this fornication. I don't know that everything fits neatly under that heading the way we normally understand it, but the bottom line is not being in a situation that defiles you before the Father. So it continues. Do not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstruation or menstrual impurity. Do not have intercourse with your neighbor's wife to be defiled by her. This is the definition of adultery, but it doesn't say that here. It says that in Leviticus 20, verse 10. You're not to give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your Elohim. I am Yahweh. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Again, very gender specific, okay? Also, you shall not have intercourse with an animal, bestiality, to defile it, okay? Not defile yourself with any of these things, for by these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. That's Canaan. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. So he's listed very specifically a bunch of sexual sins. Obviously, this audience knows, or my normal audience knows, he hasn't listed polygyny. Okay, polygyny is a man having more than one wife. It's nowhere ever condemned in Scripture. Okay, but this is where it's going to get interesting for us, right? So let me finish reading these couple verses, and then we're going to pull this all together. For the men of the land who have been before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become defiled. So the abominations listed above are the ones that defile the land, so that the land will not spew you out should you defile it, as it spewed out the nation which has been before you. For whoever does any of these abominations, these persons who do so shall be cut off from among the people. Thus you are to keep my charge, for you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you. So he's talking about Egypt, and he's talking about Canaan, or Canaan. Most of the latter language is specific to Canaan, but he says very specifically, you shall not do what is done in the land of Mitzrayim where you lived. Okay? So part of establishing Leviticus 18 is specifically to point to Egypt. And he's saying what they were doing there, you are not to do. So what were they doing there? What were they doing there? I read something that was fairly interesting, and I said, I got to go do some searching on this. And my question was ancient Egypt monogamous? Was ancient Egypt monogamous? And so obviously right here, you very quickly see some of the lines. Most ancient Egyptians were likely monogamous. Pharaoh, as the supreme ruler of Egypt, had multiple wives and concubines, known as the Great Royal Wife monogamy was the norm. And I thought, that's interesting. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So I started pulling up articles and taking a look at articles. And I don't know if these are in the same order that I looked at them, but I want to show you some things. And these are articles written, most of, if not all of these are articles that come from academic sources. These are people who have done the research and are willing to cite sources, so on and so forth. So here we go. Love, sex, and marriage in ancient Egypt. Okay. And I'm just going to hit high points in these different articles as we go through. Women in ancient Egypt were accorded almost equal status with men, in keeping with an ancient tale that after the dawn of creation, when Osiris and Isis reigned over the world, Isis made the sexes equal in power. Oh, so in Egypt, one of the things that was done was egalitarian things. They had equality, which we don't see anywhere in Scripture. What we see is equal value, but different roles and different responsibilities, and we see that all the way through Scripture. It's supported everywhere in Scripture. Sexuality in ancient Egypt was considered just another aspect of life on earth. There were no taboos concerning sex and no stigma attached to any aspect of it except for infidelity and, among the lower classes, incest. Okay, so incest is not a good deal. However, we do see in the higher status people, for example, pharaohs marrying their sisters or marrying their daughters. This kind of incestuous relationship was very common. So also in Egypt, abortions were available, and there was no more stigma attached to them than premarital sex. In fact, there is no word for virgin in ancient Egypt, suggesting that one's degree of sexual experience, or lack of any, was not thought a matter of consequence. Prostitution was not considered a concern either. No brothels have been identified in Egypt, and prostitution is not mentioned in any written work or legal decisions. Okay? So, they did not value virginity. They did not value any sort of sexual closeness in terms of the relationship for the woman. So as Egyptians valued social harmony, it made sense that they would place special emphasis on stories encouraging domestic tranquility. Interestingly, there are no similar stories in which men are to blame. Monogamy was emphasized as a value even among the stories of the gods, and male gods usually had one wife or consort, but the king was to allow as many as he could support. The point being, the common man lived in and walked in monogamy onlyism, just as we have in the culture today. But that is not what the Father has anywhere in Scripture. It's not there. So to go a little bit further here, so what we're going to do is move on to the next article now. This was actually a discussion between an adjunct professor and others. The question was, how many wives did men in ancient Egypt have? And so there are some differing opinions, but I want you to understand that while there may not be complete unity on the message is pretty clear that in Egypt they were a monogamy-only culture, at least during the time of Israel. So Mel White, adjunct professor, emeritus program at Richland College, states almost all families were one husband and one wife. The exceptions seem to be pharaohs who could take brides for political reasons, okay? This changed in the last part of the Egyptian empire when they were ruled by the Persians and later the Greeks, where multiple wives were more common then and common practice under Islam. Another here says, as Mel White says, one wife was normal except for kings, though richer men had concubines, as it happened in most societies. What about marriage in ancient Egypt? Although some aspects of marriage in ancient Egypt were similar to those of today, others were radically different and other aspects remain hazy. As in today's societies, Egyptians considered marriage to be for a lifetime, but divorces were fairly common. Incest was frowned upon, except for royalty, who could marry siblings, and marriages were expected to be monogamous except for royalty. So here we go. Let me get this straight. It's a monogamy-only culture. And in Egypt, in a monogamy-only culture, the lower class was frowned on for incest, and so the practices of the whole culture are addressed to one degree or another in Leviticus chapter 18. He's saying, don't do the incest like they did in Egypt. Later in Deuteronomy 17, where the address is specifically to kings, it says, don't multiply excessively. Rabbah means a whole bunch. It doesn't mean monogamy. So the kings here in Egypt may have been acting excessively, or at the very least, they're doing God does not want the Israelite kings to act excessively, but nowhere ever anywhere do we see that marriage must be monogamous, that men are limited to just one woman. And we're specifically told that we don't need to do things as the Egyptians. So let's continue and take a look at this. Wives were considered equal to their husbands in ancient Egyptian culture. It was important to select a compatible and congenial wife. Although men were considered the masters of their homes and the women and children were to obey him, the women were not considered subordinate to their husbands. In fact, what we read in other places is that they had no problems with divorce, and the woman got a third of, and she got to be supported by the man until she was married by another one. That sounds a whole lot like another culture I'm familiar with. Oh, yeah. Okay. Unlike today, there was no requirement for a legal ceremony for a marriage, where we never see a requirement for a legal ceremony of any sort anywhere in Scripture either, right? When a man took a woman as wife, it was understood that he had his own household. Men didn't marry until they could afford to live on their own. They didn't marry and then continue to live with his or his wife's parents. Now, scripturally or biblically, there's nothing wrong with staying in your father's house or close to your father's house to maintain the patriarchal connection. However, within that circumstance, the father needs to stay out of the son's wife's business. It's the son's job to take care of and to oversee and to properly lead his own woman. And so that's something that maybe we should talk about at a different point. Okay? Continuing on down through here. Divorce in ancient Egypt. Divorcing a wife in ancient Egypt was as simple as the process of marrying one. There were no protracted legal proceedings. The terms of the marriage were clearly specified in the marriage contract and generally adhered to. The exception to this was in the instance of the wife's infidelity. Wives were expected to be faithful to their husbands, and those who weren't, if it could be proved, sometimes were put to death either by stoning or by being burned at the stake. This was not always the husband's decision. The court could overrule a husband who wanted to spare his wife, in which case she was executed. Egyptian divorces frequently stipulated that spousal support be paid to the wife until she remarried. Unlike today, spousal support was always paid from the husband to the wife. It's usually paid from the husband to the wife today, too. Men had the majority of the wealth in ancient Egypt, except for the women who had inherited wealth, and the men usually paid spousal support to the wife, whether the couple had children or not. Some thoughts on marriage in the afterlife. Famous marriages in Egypt. Okay. King Tut and his half-sister were married. Okay, so this is incestuous. Right? Exactly what Leviticus 18 says not to do. Ramesses and Nefertiti. I think I was thinking that she was also related to him, but it doesn't say that here. I forget. I read a whole bunch of these articles that were very interesting, but they keep saying the same thing. Typically, Egypt was monogamous. Ancient Egyptians considered marriage to be the most desirable state and was intended to be monogamous, right? Except for royalty. However, there's very little evidence that legal documentation was required, okay? Before the 26th dynasty, which was 664 to 332 BC, women usually had little or no input in the choice of husband. A man and the bride's parents determined whether the marriage would take place. Marriages couldn't take place between close relatives except for royalty. Husbands and wives couldn't be related closer than distant cousins. Marriage between older men and very young girls was common. Okay, let's see, find my arrow here. Early dowries from the husband to the wife's parents were about equivalent to the price of a slave. If a husband divorced his wife, she was automatically entitled to about 1/3 of his money for spousal support. Continuing. So harems in ancient Egypt. Harem is rarely mentioned in the tombs, yet doubtless at all times it existed as one of the luxuries of the rich, right? This says further down, though, that the common Egyptian was monogamous. Polygamy was quite the exception. We rarely find two wives ruling in a house at the same time. There are, however, a few instances at different periods. Among the great man of the South, who probably died at the beginning of the reign of Ben-Amenet II, had two wives. One, Nebat, had been his niece. She bore him two sons and 5 daughters, so on and so forth. In ancient Egypt, polygamy appeared to have existed almost exclusively in royal families and was not practiced by ordinary people. It says if for no other reason than they couldn't afford it, right? Whether it's faced with evidence of polygamy or serial monogamy where a second wife is taken only after the first one died, on the whole, it seems that polygamy was not a very common practice outside of the royal family. So monogamy onlyism was an Egyptian practice, and it was the water that Israel was reared in, or that Israel was incubated in. And so this is the thought process, and it's part of why Miriam and Aaron were so upset at Moshe for taking the Cushite woman, because she's not the Midianite woman, and the Midianite woman was alive just 5 or 6 months prior to that when Jethro brings her back after Moshe gets to Mount Sinai. If you put the timelines together, Numbers 12 happens about 5 or 6 months after Exodus chapter 18, I think, when Zipporah returns. So here's the big point. Over and over, Egypt. I've heard those say, "Oh no, polygamy was something that was common in Canaan, and they weren't supposed to do what Canaanites did, or it was common in Egypt, and they weren't supposed to do what Egypt did." No, monogamy was the standard in Egypt, and they weren't supposed to necessarily do the things. Monogamy onlyism. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with monogamy, because there's not. It's okay for a man to have one wife if he chooses that. Not if he chooses that. He, according to Scripture, has the freedom to be able to take an additional wife, though I strongly recommend you have your house in order before you do that. Because if you don't, you're going to be in deep water, okay? Now, we talk about that in our Patreon and help men and women walk through the challenges of changing from a culture of the Egypt that we live in to a proper biblical culture. And then you can make that choice for yourself. But the man needs to be leading as the head and patriarch of the home. There was more on this, I thought, but I'm not going to dig deep into that. We'll take a look at a couple other items here. From our earliest preserved records in the Old Kingdom, on the formal legal status of Egyptian women, whether unmarried, married, divorced, or widows, was nearly identical to that of Egyptian men. And then further down in this article, if I recall, marriage and family law. Marriage in ancient Egypt was a totally private affair in which the state took no interest and of which the state kept no record. There is no evidence for any legal or religious ceremony establishing marriage, although there was probably a party. The preserved portion of the first late period of Setni Wast tells how Ahur and Neferkaptua fell in love and wanted to marry. The parents agreed. It goes through the story of this. Although women were legally the equals of men and could deal with property on equal terms with men, the social and political role of men was vastly different. Next paragraph. Divorce and remarriage seem to have been relatively easy and relatively common. There's little evidence, convincing evidence for polygamy, except for the king. By extension, evidence for serial monogamy. Again, sounds just like this country that we dwell in now, right? Last quick article here. Did the ancient Egyptians really marry their siblings and children? So Ramesses II married his daughter, and Cleopatra VII married her brother. But how common was marriage within royalty and commoner families? And I believe this article was one that also supported the fact that that there was sibling marriage among the general population. Brother-sister marriages occurred frequently during the time the Romans controlled Egypt. And so that's going to be a lot later than the period of Mount Sinai and thereafter when Leviticus 18 is being given, okay? Meanwhile, ancient Egypt royals sometimes married their siblings, a practice that may have reflected religious beliefs, and pharaohs sometimes married their own daughters. The question of the practice of incest in ancient Egypt has given rise to much discussion among scholars. Right? Brother-sister marriage, Roman rule, so all of that is going to be after the time that we're looking at. But here's the point. I think this is the important thing that we need to take away from this. We're told not to do what they did in Egypt. And then Leviticus 18 very clearly lays out some things, but it doesn't say monogamy only. And it doesn't say polygyny is a requirement. In fact, it says none of those things. It says stay away from your close blood relatives, okay? Then there's some other things not to do. And then there are a couple commands that are very specific that regulate polygyny. If you're going to take two sisters, it can't be having one as a rival to the other. And if you're going to take a second wife, can't be the daughter or the mother of a woman you already have, right? Those are very specific regulating commands. But nowhere in Scripture ever. And so I find it fascinating that ancient Egypt was a monogamous culture, and Moshe is exempling polygyny. He had at least 3 wives according to Scripture. We know of Numbers 12. We know of Zipporah, who was the Midianite daughter of Jethro, Ruel. But we also know that he had a father-in-law named Hobab, who was the son or son-in-law of Ruel. Go search that name, Hobab. You will find it in Numbers chapter 10 and in Judges chapter 1 and maybe also in Judges chapter 4, which help you put the pieces together and you find that Moshe had at least 3 wives. So that's kind of interesting right there. We see that the command for kings is don't have excessive, don't have too many, but that's it. There's no command that says anything, any requirement to only one. What we do see is you're not to do what they did in Egypt, and that was an expectation of monogamy onlyism or serial monogamy and easy divorce, right? We don't see divorce covered here, but we see it covered later on in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, and it seems to only be for sexual promiscuity on the part of, or some uncleanness on the part of the woman. That's not to say the man couldn't be promiscuous. There are severe judgments if he is out taking advantage of virgins or young women and then not following through and marrying them. But nowhere ever is there a judgment for a man that has more than one wife. It's not there. You won't find it in Scripture. So I find that very interesting in Leviticus chapter 18 that specifically tells us, do not do what they did in Egypt. And among those things that we know they did in Egypt was monogamy onlyism. So have one wife, have 2 wives. Have no wives. Have whatever it is that the Father leads you to. But don't be bound by the traditions of men or the rules of the Egypt that we live in. For King and Kingdom, I bid you shalom.